Good evening, all. Welcome to Critical Faculty. Today, I'm quite thrilled to have somebody that I wanted to have a word with for quite some time. I've been watching his work with my friend Derek of Myth Vision, among other shows that I follow quite closely. And today, I'm very honored to have a conversation for the first time with Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Hello, Jonathan. How are you?
Hello, I'm very, very well. Thank you for having me on. And it's the hottest day of the year in the UK. It's sort of mid-afternoon at the moment, so I've got a tiny little beer. I hope that's not going to be a problem. But let's pretend YouTube won't see that.
That's all right. I've got, well, I've been accused of drinking while on the job, but this is actually herbal tea. And some of the Arabic audience don't like me drinking wine while I'm working.
Well, mine is herbal tea for any intents and purposes it needs to be.
Fair enough. I wanted to have a word with you for quite some time about, you've got lots of wide work, mainly on philosophy, art, and it seems to be around the areas of theology. But I want to take a very, very initial step towards all of that. And instead of just addressing your book, which is 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, this is going to be the main sort of theme of hopefully our series, because 30 arguments, I think it took you and Derek probably 5 or 6 episodes.
We're still going. Yeah, I was hoping to finish it off last night and it's still going. So if we speak a few times, you'll get to know that I like to talk about this stuff. And so, I love the free flowing conversations. And if you have people that are getting involved in sort of the live chat, then, that's all good as well.
Well, one of actually my moderator here is Lena is saying she's just got your book as well. So that's brilliant to master the class.
Excellent. Well, so I guess what we'll do is have a bit of an introduction today. Start off on a few of the sort of more broad arguments to do with God. What God is, understanding the characteristics of God, because of course that can be defined in so many different ways. And then having a little go at some of the arguments to give a taster for people.
Fantastic. And I think that's going to be the beginning, because I think you and we agreed about 90 minutes today, just as a warm up. But that's why I want to step out to the background of the book, because if we are going to be talking about things like that, existence, proof, we want to go back and talk about ontology and epistemology. We want to talk about the state of existence becoming the essence of a being or of a thing, and that's ontology. And the way to know that existence, and that's or the tools, or that's epistemology. And sometimes these two can be quite confused with each other. And some actually dare to say ontology is unreachable. It's just you don't reach them for the simple reasons is it seems that things assume different forms. And we know that from quantum mechanics, the duality of a particle. And it might be not a single state of thing. And context, even outside of the physical realm, the context of a thing can define its meaning depending on the relativistic sort of approach that person observing whatever entity they're about to define.
It starts getting even more confusing because there's been a bit of a renaissance in the last couple of years or so. There's people like Bernardo Kastrup. I don't even know about him, but he's an idealist who's now starting to say, well, actually, it seems to me that, and actually it's not just seeming, he talks about quantum a lot, that at the base level, it's possibly just mentation, just mental forms, and that our understanding of the physical material world is basically an illusion of sorts. The one thing that we do know is that we experience, and so therefore he says that's the basic existence, is our experience. And although we feel things and touch things, actually there is an argument that he would say that all that experience is in fact just mental experience, and there are just representations of the physical world in our mind, but actually there isn't a physical world, and it's all mentation. So that just adds a whole layer of confusion where you take for granted we got a physical world. Well, actually there are a lot of philosophers and it's growing, I think, at the moment that will say that, well, actually no, it's not to say the physical world exists.
All right. So are you saying that there's a bit of resurgence of the Platonic idealism, where things are not really real. It's our state of mind that make them real, or they're a reflection of the perfect forms.
I don't know how Platonic it is. I'd have to read more Castrot, but it's the idea that it's almost like a Cartesian approach, which is like, what do I know indubitably exists? It is the mental experience, and therefore that's what I know is it has a primacy. And therefore, how do we know that this stuff, that matter actually really exists? Well, we're only accessing it through our mental faculties, and then he brings in arguments about quantum that he says shows that actually the physical reality is not, doesn't exist, and in fact, it's better support. The data better supports a mental reality entirely.
So,
but that's a whole different kettle of fish.
So the ontology of an apple could be food for somebody who is seeking to eat an apple. It could be an object of an artistic painting because somebody's about to paint it. It could be the bridge of a worm to cross over a bit of water on a half-bitten apple, or it could be a symbol of a brand. I think of one of the biggest brands in the world. So things like that. So what is the ontology of an apple? What's an apple then? Is it even red?
Well, that last question is particularly important. So in my previous book to the one that's just come out, so the one that's just come out, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan and Divine Design, is a real easy to read layman's book. Just absolutely bosh through that, no problem, but loads of really chunky arguments, but are broken down so that an intelligent layman can read it. The previous book I wrote was Why I Am Atheist and Not Atheist, How to Do Knowledge, Meaning and Morality in a Godless World. This is where I build up my entire worldview, and it's a somewhat more philosophical. So it starts off with an ontology, goes into epistemology, goes into natural theology and teleology and morality, then says, right, so build all these bricks up and you get to the conclusion that God doesn't exist, right? And so in that, I set out that I am what's called, and I don't know how much this is going to be to do with this, but I build up the case that I am a conceptual nominalist. Now, what's a conceptual nominalist? Big words, but nominalist is someone who denies that abstract objects exist. A conceptual nominalist says that abstract ideas do exist, but they only exist in our individual minds. Okay, so, and this is super important. So when you talk about things like morality doesn't exist out there in like some platonic form. Morality exists in our heads, in our minds, because we construct morality out of the world around us using philosophy and using the data around us. And when you ask what's redness, the Platonic realist would say redness exists out there as what's called a universal, this abstract idea that exists irrespective of whether any sentient minds exist. I would say that's absolute rubbish, in my opinion, because if all sentient minds in the universe were to die, then there would be no such thing as redness. There'd be no such thing as mathematics. There'd be no such thing as morality, because you need a mind, a bit like you need to, a sound. It's slightly different, actually. I won't go down that rabbit hole. But in order to have these concepts existing, you need a conceiver to conceive of them in the most basic form. Does that make sense?
Oh, I completely agree. Our common friend, Derek, is in the house. Hello, Derek. And thank you for the super chat. And he's asking us a question, which we obliged to answer because he's a cool dude. Derek is one of my favorite friends on YouTube. And for the viewers of Critical Faculty, I urge you please to look at his channel. The amount of work that this man puts every week, and the caliber of people, it's phenomenal. I think it is one of the best YouTube channels covering areas of theology and around myth debunking areas in the entire YouTube community, and it's very professionally run, to be honest.
Absolutely, he's a legend. I did a big 2-hour chat with him last night, actually, about this book. So it's all fresh in the mind, or at least those arguments are. What's the best argument against God? I don't know. That's really difficult. I guess problem of evil arguments are the most effective because they have an emotive quality. When you're talking about pain and suffering, there's a psychological, emotional aspect to them which is very powerful that the theist will need to overcome. And it's the idea that they have to argue that all suffering is necessary in order to obtain some greater good, which means that when you look around the world and you see tsunamis and cancer and Ebola and pandemics, that's not a tragedy. There's nothing sad or bad about that, because it is designed by an omni god, and we'll talk about omni god in a minute, in order to achieve some greater good. So you know, stop whinging, get over it. It's God's ultimate judgment. And so I think those problem of evil arguments are really strong, particularly natural evil, which doesn't involve humanity. So you can't blame us for having free will or for the fall, really. At least you can't do it very sensibly, which is to say that if a fawn is dying in a forest fire over a 3-day period, or carnivorousness, I find is a really powerful argument. Why would God design, if God was all loving, design half of animals needing to cause pain and suffering to other animals just to merely survive? So I think those are particularly strong arguments.
Oh, completely. It is very strong for me. Before I tell you about my favorite argument against God, I'd like you please, guys, to have a look at Jonathan's Amazon page, which is got wonderful. I didn't realize how many books you've written, Jonathan, but there's a lot there, and the link is in the description of the video here. So if you could please have a look, and if you find anything suitable for you to sink your teeth in and read over the weekend, especially the book that we are going to be discussing over a number of weeks. So this is a chance for you to purchase that, so you can follow with us on the arguments as we progress them one by one. My favorite argument, I try to stay away from the emotional stuff, because it can be quite seductive, and it's very, very strong and powerful. But it's quite flawed. We know that emotions are quite flawed, and they tend to be that way. So I'm more of the Schellenberg's divine hiddenness argument, because I think it's a slam dunk. But I must say, it doesn't prove the non-existence of a god, but it's there could be a god, but he is not a good one.
I would agree. I think the divine hiddenness, I mean, I talk a lot about them in here, and there's a whole chapter on that in the book. So yeah, I'd agree. Really, really powerful. And the idea, well, no, we won't get into it. I was just going to go down that rabbit hole. No, pause. I guess the place to start here is, well, there are two places to start. First of all, I want to talk about, is that okay to get stuck in?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. And I just want to say, before we start proper, like, you're from Melbourne, aren't you? Well, you're living in
Melbourne, Australia, yeah.
So in 1996, I was backpacking around Australia, and I lived in Melbourne for a couple of months. I lived in Frankston, Caulfield, St Kilda. I worked in a pizza restaurant on Brunswick Street. Is it Brunswick Street?
Wow.
I used to go wakeboarding and water skiing in Port Phillip, and we went up for Easter weekend at Tokenwall on the Murray River and water skied on there. I absolutely loved it. So yeah, you know, the Prince of Wales pub in was that St Kilda area? Anyway, there's a backpackers house there. Anyway, that's my Melbourne sort of, I had to get that out of my system. But there you go. So I reckon it's worth mentioning abductive arguments. What's an abductive argument? An abductive argument is an inference to the best to the best explanation. Okay, so here we are really going to be dealing with two hypotheses that are competing for our attention. Okay, the hypothesis.
Hold on a second, Jonathan. Yeah. Best here could be simplest. The simplest is that does it borrow a bit from Occam?
Okay, park that for a second. So the best here is, so which hypothesis best explains the data? So, for example, if you've got naturalistic atheism against omni-god theism, and we're just about to talk about omni-god in a second, but just bear with me. So you've got omni-god theism and naturalistic atheism, and then you've got any data, and then you say, right, which either predicts the data better or better explains the data. So, for example, you might look again at pain and suffering, carnivorousness. Let's just take that randomly and say, right, if I didn't know anything, right, and I was like, what would I predict the world to look like on naturalistic atheism, where we've got like evolution by natural selection, all those sorts of mechanisms, and when we've got omni-god, who is supposedly all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, what would I predict the world to be like? Would I predict carnivorousness? No, I wouldn't. I predict that on naturalistic atheism, but I wouldn't predict it on omnigod theism. Okay, so then predictions aside, then we look at all the data and say, oh, which explanation better explains this? Well, naturalistic atheism explains it perfectly well. Omnigod theism, you have to jump through hoops in order to make the carnivorousness kind of make sense under that theory. And therefore, abduction here just tells you that, well, just it's more likely that naturalistic atheism is true. It's more predictive, and it better explains the data. And then when you keep doing this, so I've got 30 arguments here that don't necessarily disprove God in and of themselves in a deductive manner, because I think if you've got a successful deductive argument, you wouldn't have believers or you wouldn't have atheists, because the deductive argument would seal the deal, right? So abductive arguments come and step in and say, okay, well, I produced 30 arguments here, and each of these arguments show that naturalistic atheism is more likely. Therefore, we are far more rationally justified in believing naturalistic atheism. So that's the kind of approach I'm going to be taking. Any thoughts? Any thoughts to that?
Oh, I completely. I mean, like, abductive argument is being adopted in science at the moment. It's obviously was inference and inductive argument, inductive logic is very strong in science, but abductive reasoning as well in science is quite prevalent. I don't know. Have you heard of a director called Darren Aronofsky? He's the one who directed Noah. And Mother with Jennifer Lawrence. These are theologically
right. Yes, I do. Yeah.
In the movie Noah with the Aussie Russell Crowe, there was the beginning of the scenes. This is sort of the beginning of humanity. Noah is not one of the closest, supposed to be closest prophets to Adam, and there are scenes where there were people chasing an animal in order to hunt him down and probably eat him. And that was frowned down upon because it was everybody's supposed to be vegetarian. And in the movie, they were showing people who brought evil on earth were mainly meat eaters. Some Christians argue that with the introduction of evil by men, things like that, like eating the flesh of other animals, were introduced as well by man. But when Jesus comes back again, the very infamous picture of the lion with the lamb, and things will be put right again. So there are some that are arguing that evil is man-made because we brought symbolic evil, and therefore the ritual of eating meat.
This is the original sin theodicy, right? So the idea, what explains suffering on earth in the context of, say, carnivorousness. And Christians might say original sin. But then in order to do that, you have to, one, establish that the Adam and Eve story is literally true. And two, you have to explain all the data that shows that carnivorousness existed far, far, far before the existence of hominids, right? So, yes, you can say that, but you would get short shrift from someone like myself, because actually it doesn't accord with any of the known data of that we have with the world. And of course, the problem is it's only a hop, skip and a jump away from young earth creationism. And of course, if you're prepared to believe in young earth creationism, you're not using the same rational faculties as I am, and we can't really have a conversation. Like I think I've got to that stage in my life now where I don't bother too much with debating young earth creationists, because there's nothing I can say. Like, I can present you with all the rational evidence. I talk about this. I talked about this last night, actually. So how to understand why young earth creationists will reject rational evidence is to understand something called terror management theory, or mortality salience. So this is the understanding of our own mortality. Now, if you are a believer in heaven and hell, and again, these are arguments we'll get onto eventually, like, you are thinking you're going to exist in heaven for eternity, right? So this is a huge carrot. And if you think, well, if I disbelieve, then I might go to hell, which is like the biggest stick you can be hit with in human conception. What that means is, if you're a young earth creationist and I present to you rational argumentation that the earth is older than 6,000 years old, that young earth creationist is not evaluating that evidence on the basis of its own intrinsic merits. That young earth creationist is evaluating that evidence in terms of whether that will invalidate him from going to heaven or not. So therefore, they will reject evidence against evidence against the young Earth, because actually they won't go to heaven for eternity if they take that on. So this becomes a psychological thing rather than evaluating rational evidence. So that's why, you know, it's so difficult to disabuse people like young Earth creationists of their position, because by doing that, you are saying you're not going to go to heaven forever.
Yes, yes. I mean, and that probably that's going to lead us to the very beginning. Let's start with that lonely entity called God, because at some point, if this entity pre-existed everything, is the Alpha, it's the very beginning. I'm trying to imagine the state of mind, if you wish, of that being. Why create it all?
So that's my first argument in the book. But what's interesting there, what's really interesting, and I talk about this in my Kalan cosmological argument book. So I wrote a book called Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalan cosmological argument, with a foreword by Jeffrey J. Lauder. So in that book, I talk about causally prior, because you can't really talk about before the universe was created, because in creating the universe, you're creating space-time. So therefore, you can't use temporal language. So the way around that is to say something like causally prior to God creating the universe, God would exist outside of time. And actually, William Lane Craig would agree with this. The problem with existing outside of time is you can have no personhood, because I would argue that all elements of personhood are temporal, like thinking and loving and having these things that are expressed or that take place over time. Like if I think and deliberate and then decide to do something, that's a very temporal thing. God can't do that because God doesn't exist in time. So therefore, there would just be an instance and then creation. You could argue that the universe is just as necessary of God. If you argue that God is a necessary being, you could say that if God is a necessary being, then God in an instant necessarily creates. Like there's no choice over that. It just happens, right? And therefore, that which is created is equally as necessary, arguably, as God. And so we get into this interesting argument that actually this is just as necessary and this is how it has to be, blah, blah, blah. But then we start thinking, well, what is God? What are these characteristics of God? Is God all powerful, all knowing and all loving? And what do those things mean? I would argue that you could imagine a God that is less than, but it wouldn't be the greatest thing you could imagine. And you're kind of devaluing your version of God. Fine, go for it. If you want a God that's evil, if you want to, again, you've still got to present me with the evidence to support that. But I think for most theists, they would argue for the classical theism, which is the idea that God is all-knowing, knows everything, omniscient, all-powerful, omnipotent, and all-loving, omnibenevolent. And with that, you get divine foreknowledge, knows of all of future events before, anything happens. So, but of course, you can contest all those things. And the problem is when you argue with theists, they will say, well, that's not my version of God. So you kind of have to pick a version that does the most for the most people, which is, I think, classical theism.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a second here.
Yeah.
And we'll use a bit of science and cosmology. Time is a very interesting property that some argue it doesn't actually really exist. And we know that in quantum mechanics, you can end up with something called retrocausality, where the future can affect the past, because they're really nothing of that sort. The past, the future, and the present are product of finite minds living in a certain time era. But if you are an infinite being, time doesn't exist, because infinity plus 1 equals infinity, and infinity minus 2000 equals infinity.
I would have to challenge you what an infinite being actually means there. Are we talking an infinite set of... So I this idea of God being an infinite being is just like, it sounds lovely, doesn't it? But actually, really, what does that mean, theist? But yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. Basically, it means it's the same... We're going to give it the same quality, for the argument's sake, of the universe that Einstein proposed at some point. The steady-state theory. It's something that is always there. Never had a beginning. Was always there. It's a necessary being. It's something that was always been there. So you take that quality from the proposed existence with a capital E, which could be the universe, because now the conversation going to the Big Bang might be just a local event, and that's the beginning of our local universe. But then the actual existence of the ensemble of universes out there of verses could be infinite, and therefore they've always been there. You take that quality and give it to an intentional entity rather than one that it just is not even aware that it exists, to one that is intentional, that is a mind, and give it the same quality, and voila, time evaporates.
There are indeed lots of competing theories of time, and the classic ones are the A theory and the B theory. You know, presentism, the idea that the present is fact, the past is been and gone, and the future is a potential. Mm-hmm. And that's what say, for example, William Lane Craig will use that in some kind of variation of that, and have he argues for an absolute time frame in the universe. But of course, special relativity says that, well, time is relative. Like, time is not the same here as it is over there. Mm-hmm. And that makes a mockery of that, which then causes problem for Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, so the B theory of time better accords with special relativity, such that you can argue for a block time universe where the past, the present, and the future are equally facts, and we just have maybe a spotlight of where we are in the universe, but it's all a fact in some kind of four-dimensional block universe. And of course, then you're completely invalidating free will right off the bat. Time is fascinating. I think it's interesting when a theist like William Lane Craig says, time doesn't exist until God creates it, and then in creating this universe, space-time, God enters into time. I don't know how that works then with the creation of other universes as well.
Very, very interesting, because when you think about it, the act of deciding something or thinking about something and then deciding to do it, and that's before creating. So the act of creation itself requires pondering, probably, and then creating, and that's temporal.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. So that none of that could happen. So it happens in an instant. So therefore, there's no thinking. There just is God existence. You know, and that's that. And an interesting argument, again, I mean, this is a very Kalam cosmological argument sort of area. And interestingly, what I talked about conceptual nominalism is a huge component of my approach to the Kalam, and it completely defeats the Kalam conceptual nominalism as opposed to Platonic realism, because things only begin to exist when our minds understand them beginning to exist. So, but I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I love that conversation. So causality is arguably a temporal thing, right? So, you know, there's a sequence to causality. A causes B causes C. Actually, I'd argue it's a big matrix, but, you know, things happen in a temporal fashion. If you don't have temporality, you don't have causality. You can't have causality is one argument. In other words, if God is existing outside of time, God literally can't cause anything. So it's an argument to say that God actually couldn't cause the universe. It's breaking metaphysics, the metaphysics of causality. But again, it depends how you define causality.
This is fascinating. So if God was outside of time as we know it, and therefore sort of infinite, and then decided to create the universe.
Of course, couldn't decide, but yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But, you know, it does suggest time. There's got to be time spent there to do that. I mean, in the entire Christian theology, there is a bit of a delay there always. The logos. And it's also emphasized by the Quran and the doctrine of Islam, where when God, if he wants to have anything created, he needs to utter the word be, and then it is in the being. And when you think about it, a more powerful being would just think it, and it happens but the process of uttering a word that will have a certain time lag and delay, which is the logos here, and in the Islamic doctrine is uttering of a certain magic word to make creation happen. That is something really ridiculous when you think about it.
It's so anthropomorphic. But these are creation stories that are written by humans that didn't necessarily understand these kind of ideas, and writing a thing that sounded brilliant and it fits in with their understanding of the universe. But you look back now and you think, we can't make sense of that. And why would God be constrained to only be able to create on uttering something? Of course, that means that God is constrained. Therefore, God is not omnipotent, and it causes all sorts of problems.
It's so human, because us as kids go watching a magic show is not perfect until the magician
Abracadabra. You said
Yes.
the magic word wrong. Yeah.
Or open sesame, to open the cave
Yeah.
for all the treasures behind. It's just, there's a password, and it's it's like the rite of passage. You got to say the right words and be in the right frame of mind, and it's insane. It's so human the way it's presented.
Yes, absolutely. And so what we have here, and the first argument in the book, we haven't even got to the first argument in the book, but the first argument of the book is entirely to do with this, which is, why did God create anything at all? So the idea, and this is an argument that Justin Schieber, he used to be on the Reasonable Dance podcast and used to have a few sort of debates here and there. So he came up with the argument from non-God objects. And the idea is that if God exists, this is causally prior to creating the universe, as God exists in, let's call that God world. So God exists in God world, and God is ontologically perfect. That means that God would have no desires or no wants or needs. Like, God could literally need or want for nothing, because God exists in ontological perfection. But the problem is, why bother then creating the universe at all? If you don't have any needs, you would have no need to create. You just exist in ontological perfection. So therefore, it suggests that just by creating, God is lacking something in order to be gaining that lack by creating. So we can almost say, if you really believe in an ontologically perfect God, then God would simply create nothing. And the fact that there is something here is disproof itself of God existing.
Oh, it's not just creating something, and it's creating something with a lot of caveats and things to be achieved, and tests to pass, and consequences if you don't pass the tests. That is a sign of one hell of a needy God.
Yeah. So when you look at the Old Testament, and again, this is where like belief becomes very particular, and I use particular as a particular word. Like, there's something called the scandal of particularity and a problem of particular. Hello?
Sorry, there was a bit of a glitch there. Do I have you back, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm here. I was just going to say, when you look at the Old Testament, and it's very particular, and that's a very particular word. There's something called the scandal of particularity and a problem of particularity, which is to say that the Bible looks very parochial and very much set in a particular time in a particular place, and it doesn't look like it was created by an all-loving, when God demands that humans get like circumcisions and things like that, you're thinking, well, what's going on there? But it seems that the original point was, it seems that in the Old Testament that God really, really wants praise. Everything's about burnt offerings and praise. And you're like, well, if you are this ontologically perfect God, none of this would be necessary. What's going on here? You seem to be very needy, as you say.
Yeah, considering as well the main condition to enter the paradise of that God isn't predicated on being nice to each other, good to each other. I mean, sometimes it's mentioned, but that's not the main criteria. The main criteria is always, in Islam, for example, you've got to accept that God, and that's the one sin that can never be forgiven. And you can actually kill, steal. And if you utter the shahada, or the witnessing of Allah Almighty, then you can all be forgiven of everything. I think it's very similar to Christianity, where you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and voila, everything's so. If this is not self-centered, I mean, you would respect more of a God who says, "Look, you know what? I don't care about you acknowledging me or not. Just be nice to each other."
I mean, these are whole arguments that we'll get onto later when we talk about what gets you into heaven and what gets you into hell. Whether it's just faith, whether it's like good deeds, just being a good person. But then if it's just good deeds, then the faith means nothing. And if it's just faith, then you can be like believing in Jesus and his redemptive qualities, but be a complete bastard. And then how does that work? So it must be some combination, and that all gets very, very complicated. But the syllogism for the argument for non-God objects, I'll just throw that to you. So it's one: if the Christian God exists, then God world is a unique, best possible world. So this is our idea that God existing on God's own is just uniquely ontologically perfect. If God world is a unique best possible world, then the Christian world would maintain God world. God world is false because a universe or any non-God object exists. Conclusion, therefore, the Christian God, as so defined, does not exist. So it's the idea that, you know, why would an ontologically perfect being want to debase reality by creating something that's essentially imperfect? And we know it's imperfect because Adam and Eve and humanity are broken and fallen.
An ontologically perfect being. I think this is a good segue to start talking about the Greek word omni, which means all or all encompassing. Don't you think that gathering all the perfections of everything possible or known would potentially lead to contradictions?
Yes, I think, you know, this is largely what I'm looking at in the book, which is yeah, you can talk about, and we can talk about this later, which is perfectly just and perfectly merciful just don't work together. You can't have that. That's a really easy one. But the biggest problem is divine foreknowledge. And this is why there's been a recent movement away from God having divine foreknowledge to something called open theism. Open theism is the belief that God doesn't know the future outcome of freely willed events. Now, I don't believe in libertarian free will, but let's park that for a second. Now, if you have divine foreknowledge, what's the point in God creating everything if he knows it's all, he knows everything that's going to happen, just, you know, knows it's all going to happen, but also would have no need to have joy, get extra joy. So it's not like I'm creating to get extra joy because I'm ontologically perfect. I don't need joy, extra, more joy. I have a perfect amount of joy. So there's no need to create, but you're creating knowingly that things all go wrong. And then if you look at the Bible, God gets it all wrong. His design and creation goes wrong. And he in the Noah's flood, he just like destroys all humanity by 8 people because he cocked it up and then starts again. It's like doing a puzzle on a table and then realizing you messed up and just throwing it all on the floor and getting out a new puzzle and starting all again. It's like, this is perfect. None of this makes sense in light of a perfect God. But then we have the idea of perfection. I think is an interesting word to look at because I don't believe that perfection exists. And quite often I argue these things from a Christian's point of view, for example. So I say, like, if you believe in perfection, if you believe that all loving makes sense, then okay, let's go with that. Where does it lead you? It leads you into real problems. But I would say perfection doesn't even make sense in itself, because I would say perfection is a goal-orientated value statement. So you say something is perfect for, right? So if you're going to play rugby, you want to get a rugby ball. The rugby ball is perfect for playing rugby, but if you try and play cricket with it, you're going to get in trouble. It's not perfect for that. So you can't look at the ball just on its own and say this is a perfect ball. It's not. It's perfect for a task I might want to put it towards, but just in and of itself. So saying God is perfect is kind of meaningless, and unless you say God is perfect for doing something. But then you say the only thing that makes sense is God is perfect for being God. It's a tautology that is not giving you any useful information. So yeah. I think the term God is perfect is itself a flawed concept.
I agree. I think Einstein once said, "Don't judge a fish by its ability to climb a ladder," or something like that, of that sort of sense. Because you're right. You know, if it's fit for a certain purpose, what are you comparing it with, and what context? It's quite vague. I've got Chris here's asking a question. Yeah. Thank you for the super chat. Does the book cover presupposition?
Well, not particularly. So there's presupposition in what particular context? So you could say presupposing the truth of the Bible. And actually, most of the arguments here aren't to do with the Bible. There are some that bring in Bible, and we'll talk about Adam and Eve in a minute. So there are, but you know, it depends what form of presuppositionalism you're talking about. Of course, that's an epistemological approach, which basically says I'm just presupposing the truth of this. So in terms of the Bible, that's like, I believe the Bible is true no matter what, deal with it. And it's like, yeah, but it's not true. Yeah, but it is true. Like, I presuppose it's true. So
but, I mean, when you think about it, Jonathan, I mean, the word itself has lots of issues. The word presupposition on its own, if you're going to use that as epistemology, you're going to be up for trouble here. You know, why presuppose anything? Well, the only reason why you presuppose is you have no access to the information at all.
So the way that could be used here is kind of Alvin Plantinga's kind of properly basic belief. So you say that I believe God exists because I just have this properly basic belief. and there's nothing that the evidence and rationality can do about that. But then equally, you and I can say, well, I've just got a properly basic belief that God doesn't exist. Deal with that. And so, you end up getting nowhere. So you can try the Alvin Plantinga approach, which I think is sort of a form of presuppositionalism in a way.
You see, properly basically believe that's William Lane Craig's game. He's trying to get you to admit certain things. But David Hume,
sometimes,
I mean, that was inferred in a lot of philosophies. The fact that the law of non-contradictions can never be broken. Where does logic come from? It seems to be right whether we're here to evaluate or not, mathematics and things like that. But David Hume, in his book, and I can't remember now the book, but he is actually saying there's no such thing as foreknowledge or things that you presuppose. All of these are reverse engineered experiences that we take back and sort of abstract that, put them in an abstract realm, but they are based on experience to start with.
I'd agree. Yeah. You won't find disagreement with me from there. I mean, I think things like logic, so things like mathematics, which is effectively a form of logic, is a language that we use. Again, this is going back to conceptual nominalism. So mathematics does not exist out there. What we do is we create a language that allows us to understand reality and navigate reality, and we call that mathematics. And we represent reality in mathematical ways. So logic, how does logic? Well, something like the law of non-contradiction, I would argue, and I probably need to do a lot more thought on this, but I would argue that it's necessary just for mere existence. So in this book here, I have something called the argument from format, which says that if you don't have regularity, this kind of goes to humane thinking. If you don't have strict regularity, right? If things don't adhere strictly to a behavior that is unchanging, then you would just not have reality. Because imagine if like laws, physical laws, natural laws only worked like 93% of the time, you would just get decoherence. You get just things would stop existing. Like so much stuff is going on all the time. You couldn't get reality. You couldn't get a meaningful reality. Like you wouldn't get off the ground. So in order to have reality, it's just built into, it's like a necessary component of reality that things are regular.
But therefore, Jonathan, is not an a priori then. It's still a posteriori. It's still really a language that will explain the state of affairs.
Yeah, it depends what you're talking about. It depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about what is a priori, like our knowledge of that, then yeah, I mean, all knowledge is a posteriori, I would say. But what I'm trying to say is that logic is kind of built into the fabric of reality. Like the law of non-contradiction, like you simply just can't have something that is something and something else at the same time, like existing and not existing at the same time. With quantum notwithstanding, like I just think these things, like if you don't have them, you don't have reality. We do have reality, so it's necessarily baked into the system.
Yeah, but even David Hume sort of argued that the infamous example of the married bachelor, it's connected to human logic of what is to be married. If all humans cease to exist at some point, that uttering doesn't make any sense anymore. That phrase is incoherent. It makes no sense.
Because of course you're talking about language. You can get onto Wittgenstein here, but language is our way of understanding reality and communicating ideas. We have ideas, but like without sentient minds, you have no ideas. So you've just got a dead universe. You're not going to have morality. You're not going to have the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, these are just tools effectively that we have constructed in order to understand our place in the universe.
So have Christianity, because I think that omni introduction, it came mostly in Christianity, because in Judaism, you don't see that perfect God. And definitely before the Abrahamic gods, the gods of the Olympus, Mount Olympus, and the gods of Egypt, and the old gods were not perfect. They were sometimes evil.
So that's a really interesting area. So over there, you've got Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book, God and Anatomy. So that looks at, very accurately, looks at how in the Hebrew Bible, God is anthropomorphic, right? So we had created, we as humans had created God in our own image, and so God had body parts. God was a jealous God. God didn't know where Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden. You know, all these problems for God's omni characteristics, right? For omni-God. That is not omni-God. That is a very parochial, man-centered, anthropocentric God. So, but what then happened is 2,000 years of philosophy and theology happened. And we start with this corporeal God that then gets abstracted out that, because as time went on, people realized that caused a lot of problems and was very parochial and didn't do a very good job theologically. So we abstracted God out of that for 2,000 years until God is now some abstract entity out here, outside of the universe. Like, doesn't get involved, doesn't walk around the universe, all this kind of stuff. God is just here as a kind of conceptual idea almost. But then, now here's the problem. That's fine, and maybe that's fine, but to say that both of those things are true is now a bit of a problem. So the theologians have abstracted God out to this point that this thing cannot be consistent with this thing. So you've got to drop one of them. You've got to, like, did God go and show his butt to Moses? Did God, you know, have like all the parts of the body that book shows? Did God do these things, show his face and all this kind of stuff? Well, no, it's just symbolic. Okay, we'll drop that. That didn't happen. It ain't true. But if that didn't happen, then all of those foundation bricks of, say, the Exodus story didn't happen either, which means that if Jesus is coming along as an incarnated God figure to fulfill every jot and tittle of the law, but all of that never happens, then who was Jesus? So what I've done, and sorry, I'm going to spam my books again, but I've got a book on the nativity and a book on the resurrection to saying, okay, these things didn't happen as reported in the Gospels. They just didn't happen, right? Certainly not as claimed in the Gospel. And the third book I'm writing presently with an archaeologist is a book on the Exodus, which is to say that, okay, these two pillars of the Jesus story don't work, but these two pillars are built on an underlying foundation. Let's see if that makes sense or not. No, it doesn't. Archaeologically, historically, theologically, philosophically, none of that works, right? Or is nicked from other existing cultural, elements. And so you're just left with, well, okay, this is all rubbish. And you can retreat to some abstract idea of God still, some kind of deistic God. But this whole parochial Jesus Judaism cult didn't happen.
Yeah. Did Christianity did they try to have the cake and eat it too by creating an abstract God who still walked among us?
Yeah, so what happened is while Jesus was supposedly alive, the idea, and as he died and shortly thereafter, the Holy Trinity didn't make sense. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that wasn't in their conception. John came along and you started getting Jesus being a divine figure. I would say Matthew, Mark, and Luke saw him as a Messiah. John and the theology that was surrounding John in the community had developed Jesus now into a fully divine figure. So you get the Holy Trinity, but the Holy Trinity makes absolutely no sense. No one makes sense of the Trinity, which is why the most prevailing theory is called Mysterianism, which is, it's a mystery. I don't know how it works, but it works. Well, that looks very much like an unevidenced assertion to me.
Very, very, very true. A question for you here, Jonathan. I think Dr. Oppie is one of the people who actually purchased your books.
I edited another book on natural law that written by Günter Laird that he's got a copy of. I've got. Do you know what? I haven't read Oppie, but I do have at least one of his books that is on my reading list. So yeah, thank you. I need to get onto that. But the problem is when you write so much, you actually don't have enough time to read. I'm always writing. So, but yeah, it's a problem I have. But I will get on.
If this is Graham Robert Oppie, I think he's actually one of the people. I'm looking at your Amazon pages as well. And your book has been purchased by some prominent people like Seth Andrews, Bart Ehrman, and it says there Graham Robert Oppie is one of the people who.
Really? Can you tell that on Amazon?
Let me show you in a second.
Oh my goodness, you've just made my day.
Yeah, I'll show you. I think you should take a screenshot and parade that because it's quite the thing.
Yeah, because I'd quite like to have a chat with Seth Andrews at some point.
Can you see on the left-hand side?
Yeah.
And it says here, people who bought your book: David Madison, John Loftus,
Yeah.
Joshua Aaron, David Fitzgerald, Richard Carrier, Francesca, Bart Ehrman, Seth Andrews, Edward Babensky, Graham, Robert Opie, and Bill Zeucher.
Yeah, I am now. You've just given me all my Christmas presents all at once. So I've written a couple of chapters for a few of Loftus's anthologies, actually, myself. So yeah, that's cool. So I think this abstraction of God is an interesting development, and I completely understand why that would happen, because actually philosophy really, like, philosophy has primacy here. Like, history can be wrong. We can make mistakes, and we can be wholly wrong about what happened at a certain time, and it depends on a load of evidence. But if that doesn't work with like the logic of philosophy, then so you've got to get the philosophy right before you can start getting history right. And so I can understand why God has been abstracted, and it's just then trying to marry these two ideas is just an impossible task, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a request here, and it's a popular one, and I think I do second that, because I think audiobooks are becoming a thing. Like Jonathan, I drive quite a lot, and I stopped reading because I don't have the time. I listen to books.
Yeah.
Dan Barker is great. He's got that nice
I love
voice. I think you've got what it takes, and if you have the time, recording some of your books, I think will be quite a thing.
I'm gonna have to make it happen. I know this. Yep, you're right. Get with the times, Pierce.
Yeah, especially with that British accent, this is going to be quite interesting.
So that's the argument from non-God objects. So, which is okay. Why create anything? That's a problem. Okay. So let's now move on to God as a poor designer. And there's loads of stuff we can talk about in this area. Let's talk about Adam and Eve to begin with. Now, remember, we're believing here in this idea of an omni-God that has full divine foreknowledge. So God knows ahead of the game exactly what will happen. Everything. Oh, am I still there?
Yeah, I'm trying.
Okay.
It keeps glitching. 1 second.
Okay, I'll. Yay! I exist.
Keeps glitching on me today.
Sorry. Adam and Eve. If God knows in advance exactly what's going to happen with everything that is created, let's have a look at Adam and Eve. So God creates Adam and Eve, fully knowing that they are going to make the wrong choice in the Garden of Eden, yet creates them anyway. In other words, God can't get angry with what happens in the Garden of Eden because God knows that that's going to happen and creates anyway. So that's an interesting thing. But also, the whole story really doesn't make any sense, because they have not eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So they have no moral knowledge. God says, don't eat from that tree. Hang on. So if they break that rule, they're not doing a moral bad because they have no knowledge of morality. So the whole story is back to front. It doesn't make any sense. And that's because it's just a myth, right? It is obviously just a myth. But if you believe in Adam and Eve literally, then this story doesn't make sense. So God says, don't eat from the tree. And they're like, basically they're looking and saying, the command, don't eat from the tree, is just a neutral, kind of almost meaningless thing. All it is like, well, don't do that. Yeah, but it doesn't matter if I do. There's no mattering. There's no moral mattering because I have no knowledge of good and evil. Then they eat from the tree after being tempted by the serpent. And then God gets angry with them and kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. But A, they didn't have any moral knowledge. B, you designed them in such a way that you knew they would do that, and they did it anyway. You could have designed them differently, but you didn't. So therefore, this is on you, God. This is on you that they did that. So you can't punish them, really, or you can, but it's completely unfair. So does that make sense so far?
Oh, yeah. And remember, he kicks them out as well in fear of them eating from the other tree, so they become like him.
Yeah. You know, he has fear. Actually, there's a plural use there as well, because it's like us. I think it's, you know, there's this pantheon of gods, of course, and this
Elohim in Hebrew is a plural anyway.
Exactly. But the other problem is a two-horn dilemma for the Adam and Eve story, and the two-horn dilemma is this, right? So imagine Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve have to kind of like pass this test or fail. They fail the test, right? And then God punishes us. There's a fall. So we are all fallen and we are all punished in a way as a result of what Adam and Eve did. Right. So that is fair only if Adam and Eve are representative of us. What that means is that if I ask you, Hanney, if you were put down in the Garden of Eden and God said the same thing to you, then the idea of them being representative of us is the fact that you would also do that. In fact, all of us would have failed that test and would have disobeyed God. All of us would have done that. And so therefore, by God testing all of humanity by using Adam and Eve, that is representative, right? So that is kind of fair. The problem is it makes God look like a really horrible designer because he's designed all of us in such a way that we would fail the very first test he's given us. And
Jonathan, if God's divine foreknowledge includes the crucifixion of Jesus and the betrayal of Judas Iscariot, Adam and Eve must eat from the tree. Yeah. They have to. Otherwise, that foreknowledge won't be fulfilled.
So, well, you can talk about problem of evil here, which is really interesting. I don't think I've applied the problem of evil to Adam and Eve before. I might have done. My memory is not so good these days. So the idea is that any evil or suffering must beget a greater good. Because, there can be no such thing as gratuitous suffering. This is part of God's omni characteristics, right? If God is all loving, there can be no gratuitous suffering. So in other words, that Adam and Eve did that thing is actually ultimately good. It's ultimately good that they did that because of what comes along later. So yeah, it becomes like kind of crazy. Any evil there can be. The problem is that you look at all evil and you can't whinge about it because there's no such thing as a tragedy. It all has to happen to bring about a greater good.
And it proposes a very, very kind of, I think it's quite promiscuous and evil narrative here, that God has a story. It's like he's a novelist. He and he wrote a full story all the way to the end. And we're there, the characters of that story. We're acting out our roles. You got to do them. Otherwise, the novel won't end.
Yeah, but of course, if you know all these things, and what's the point of doing this? Especially if by doing it, you are necessarily committing people to suffering. So I just want to get back to the two horn dilemma. So the one horn dilemma is that Adam and Eve are representative of all humanity. So you would have made that same decision, Hanney, and that's fair. But it makes God look like a very poor designer. So he's designed all of humanity to fail. The other horn of the dilemma is that if Adam and Eve did that, but they're not representative of humanity. So if Hanney was in the Garden of Eden, you would have actually said, no, I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to eat that fruit. Thank you very much. And serpent, you can go and do one. I'm going to listen to God. Then what that means is that God is punishing us on behalf of a non-representative sample of his creation, which is deeply, deeply unfair. So we are all being punished with original sin on account of the decision of people that are completely unconnected to us. So God is completely unfair. So you have the two horns of this dilemma are that one, God is an absolutely terrible designer, or two, God is unfair. And there doesn't seem to be any way out of this, because God is creating humans in order that they suffer on account of what Adam and Eve did, and he designed them in such a way to do that.
Of course, yeah. And when you think about it, it was the woman who ate from the fruit first, and then give her man, and the creation of a woman from the rib of man was kind of an afterthought anyway. But if the women weren't created, because that was a possibility, and reproduction might have just been through a slightly different mechanism, then you could have argued that might have never happened in the first place. But everything that God does lead to the inevitable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you've got to remember that God knows everything's going to happen, and so this is all just a set of dominoes that's taking place, because God has divine foreknowledge of every single counterfactual of every single event that's going to take place on this universe.
But this is where some Christians start to apologize. You're saying, well, divine foreknowledge doesn't mean necessarily the planning of the actual action. God knows what you're going to do, but because of free will, he cannot intervene. And he knows what you're going to be choosing.
Okay, so that's just like, yeah. So this is, I disagree with this argument. So I would present something called the grounding objection to this, which is to say that, so this is the idea that it's kind of like, I'm going to watch a DVD. I'm going to watch people don't use DVDs anymore. I'm going to watch a film now, and it's going to play out in front of me, but I don't make it play out like that. But the problem is that God, that's a bad analogy, because God has literally designed everything and created everything and has ultimate responsibility over it so that it happens in that way. So the problem is God has all these infinite array of possible worlds he could create, and chose and created this one, right? So it could have happened in other ways, but it didn't, because God chose this one and knew all the eventualities and chose this one and designed the universe in such a way that it would happen in this way, and he knew it would happen in this way and chose it this way. So I think that that's a real problem. But the grounding objection says that if say at 2:00 on a next Tuesday afternoon, you're going to make a cup of tea, right? And God knows that indubitably, then if you were put in a slightly different situation, you wouldn't have decided to make a cup of tea. Then there must be something that grounds your decision to make a cup of tea within that first causal circumstance. This is called a grounding objection. I don't want to go too much into this, but the idea is that there must be something that grounds all of our decisions to do things in certain situations, and therefore the fact that you can't just let God off the hook with the whole free will argument, because he knows what's going to happen and has designed and created the causal circumstances in which we decide all the things that we decide.
Jonathan, I urge you to watch this movie. It's written here. It's called Mother. If you haven't seen it before, you got to see this one here.
Is that the one with Nicole Kidman?
No, that's Jennifer Lawrence and Javier Bardem.
Right.
This is theology. This is a genius, and it talks about because God keeps creating, and the whole thing collapses and gets destroyed. And at the end of the movie, Javier Bardem plays God. And I want to kill it for you, because a lot of people watched this movie and they thought it was a horror movie. They did not get the biblical, because it's there's a lot of allegories in the movie. So if you're not biblically smart, you'll think it's a horror movie. They play Jesus. They play the entire creation. And Javier Bardem, the husband, is God. And Jennifer Lawrence plays nature, and he needs nature to keep creating, but she complains because he keeps destroying nature. And at the very end, she asked God, why do you keep doing that? He said, and he was quite apologetic, he said, I'm very sorry, it's in my nature. So it's almost like God's ontology. He's compelled to create.
This is one of the later arguments in the book, right? Which we'll come to, which is, if God knows his own future freely will, if God knows his own future events, his own actions and events, then God is constrained by his own nature. God is on a railroad track and cannot have any free will. God has to do. God is the most non-free will entity that you can ever imagine. But we'll get onto that. That's a later one. Just a couple of analogies I want to bring in on the kind of design front here. That imagine you, Hanney, you're an amazing scientist in a lab, and you create a sentient life form out of test tubes. You're creating basically out of nothing. You're creating these sentient life forms. Now, at the design, you're at the table at the design stage. You're like, I know 100% these life forms are going to go out into the town and they're going to rape and pillage and kill. They're going to cause right problems. Some of them will do some nice things, maybe give to charity and do some nice stuff. But basically, these life forms are going to go out and cause mayhem. So I'm designing them, and that's what they're going to do. I know that, and I create them anyway. I know 100% what they're going to do. I am responsible for bringing them into existence such that they do that. And if I didn't do this, they wouldn't do that. So you do this, and you create these life forms, and you design them in such a way that they go out and do all this stuff, right? And they're raping and pillaging in the village. Now, I would expect the police to come to your door as this scientist and say, we hold you, even though they freely did what they did, we hold you at least somewhat morally culpable for the actions that took place out there because you knew 100% that was going to happen and you did it anyway. Does that make sense as an analogy?
Even in the legal system, sometimes the inciter of a crime can take actually higher degree of punishment than the perpetrator themselves, because they were able to manipulate a person into the person becomes just a tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So imagine this. So there's a second analogy here, that you are both a designer and a CEO of a car company, right? So you sat at your table again, you design this car and you think, right, I know this car is going to break down quite often and will veer off the road and will kill its passengers or other people on the road. I know that's going to happen, but oh well, I'm going to create it anyway. So because actually a lot of the time the car is going to do some good and it will transport people to the hospital and whatnot. But I'm going to create this anyway. I'm going to design it and create it anyway, and I'm going to take it to market. So you then produce this car. Lo and behold, it breaks down. It crashes. Now, 100% in our society today, you as a designer would be taken to court. You'd be like, you designed it such that would happen. You are morally culpable for this car breaking down and killing people. You'd be like, well, yeah, I did know it's going to happen. You would be had in prison. But it gets even worse, this analogy, because or worse for God, because now imagine you, Hanney, you've designed and created this car. You send it out to the marketplace, and then it crashes, and then you say, these cars that keep on crashing, I want payment for that. I want payment from you guys for the fact that these cars crashed. That's atonement. I want payment back to me for the fact that these cars that I designed and created and sent out into the world crashed.
And payment for eternity, forever.
Yeah. And that payment is an ongoing direct debit payment from now until the end of time.
Yeah. Oh, it's mad. It's absolutely insane. I mean, if I don't understand why people would believe in such a thing. It's such a demeaning, horrible thing to believe in.
So at the beginning of my resurrection book, where I go into the real historical analysis of the gospel accounts and the theological analysis, I actually start the book off by doing quite a bit of philosophy and saying, right, the resurrection makes absolutely no sense if the Holy Trinity makes no sense and if the atonement makes no sense. The Holy Trinity makes no sense and atonement makes no sense. Therefore, I don't need to write the rest of this book. The resurrection is nonsensical. But let's just park these two massive problems to the side and do the gospel exegesis. So I go and do that anyway. But I start off by saying I don't need to do this because atonement and the Holy Trinity, they just make no sense.
Oh, I think vicarious redemption is immoral. You're supposed to be building character. They always blame it on building characters. And suppose we've got a bit of evil because that's how your character gets built. But then with vicarious redemption, it's basically saying, you don't have to do a thing. You don't have to take responsibility for your actions. You just believe in this idea, and all is going to be good. And it's incredible.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to say on kind of the design front of God at the moment is more of a biological statement, a statement about biology. And this is what's called a disteleological argument. You hear about teleological arguments and you get things like, Paley's watchmaker, or you get like irreducible complexity, or I don't know, all these kind of different arguments. So a teleological argument looks like this. So this is what a Christian might say. Living things are too well designed to have originated by chance. Therefore, life must have been created by an intelligent creator. The creator is God. So that's your basic teleological argument. A disteleological argument says an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent creator God would create organisms that have optimal design. Organisms have features that are suboptimal. Therefore, God either did not create these organisms or is not omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Right. So, and I think that's a pretty good standard disteleological argument. And then you say, right, let's just look at human anatomy alone. So just concentrate on humans. And you're like, right, women die in childbirth, ectopic pregnancies, our digestive canals and our breathing systems are so closely related that when we eat, we can choke to death really easily that other animals don't do, but we do.
Yeah, we use the same area.
Yeah, we've got hernias, we've got wisdom teeth, we've got the appendix and appendicitis. We've got some muscles and nerves have absolutely no use because they're kind of left over from our evolutionary past. We can wiggle our ears, some of us, but
Yeah.
not all. Interestingly, not all of us. What's the point of that? Like, that makes no, again, abductive argument. What would you predict on Omnigod, the best designer in human conception, or naturalistic atheism and evolution? You know, would we expect junk DNA and junk muscles and nerves on Omnigod? No, because God's the greatest designer ever. It's not just slapdash haphazard. Evolution only uses the bricks that are available to evolution at the time. I'm using the term of agency for evolution. Of course, it's not an agent, but you understand what I'm saying. So, so the back is really poorly designed, and we get backache really badly. We're very bad at synthesizing our own vitamin C. That's defective, and that can lead to scurvy in certain circumstances. Our eyes are actually poorly designed, and we have inverted retina that can cause many adaptations, including blind spots. And other animals don't have this, or have better eyes in certain situations, whatever. The fact is, just looking at humans, we have suboptimal design. There's no doubt about that in my book. There's absolutely no doubt. Now, the thing is, and this is something to take away from today. If you're going to take anything away from today, it's that, and again, to go back to your abductive argument, it's that all data in the universe, every single bit of data. So, Hanney, that you stubbed your toe this morning, or that you have, I don't know, that you are partially schizophrenic, or that you've got a friend with a phobia of spiders, or that like a car crashed into the wall the other day. Every single bit of data you see in the world around you needs to be explained in Omnigod, in that framework of Omnigod. So if you've got an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, everything needs to be explained within those metrics, right? So when we have suboptimal design, we don't need to, we can adequately explain that perfectly well with evolution by natural selection. But how do you explain that under God? So therefore, which hypothesis does this data better support?
What do you think about some Christians now realizing that they've dug themselves a very deep hole by introducing the omni concept, and then now they're going with the maximally?
So it's basically what happens when you do philosophy is you get forced into a corner. You're like, oh my goodness. So this is why. So I talked about open theism earlier. So I do understand this, which is like, if you believe God has full divine foreknowledge of this universe, this makes God look like a bastard. Like, it really does. There's no way around this. You got a tsunami that kills 230,000 people. God has created plate tectonics, and God knew that would happen. And if God knew that would happen and creates a universe anyway with Ebola and cancer and all these things and tsunamis, and goes and then doesn't step in to save people, then God just looks like a bastard. So how does a Christian get God off the hook here? God has to maintain a perfect place. So he can't know that's going to happen, or he can't know certain things are going to happen. So freely willed decisions are going to bring about, I don't know, Holocaust. But then the problem is that if you say that, then God is just blindly creating with very little predictive power about what's going on. Now, Facebook can predict human behavior on 300 likes. This was back in 2015, right? 2015 had an algorithm that better predicted your human behavior on 300 likes from Facebook than your own partner could predict of you. Like, if Facebook can do that, then God can predict a little. So open theism comes a bit unstuck here by making God look like a kind of haphazard, like blind creator that has less predictive capability of Facebook.
This is really interesting. We've got another 15 minutes for the 90 minutes. We're still okay to go for another 15?
Yeah, we got. We can probably squeeze in the next one.
Sure.
That'll be, if that's all right with you.
Oh, that'll be great, fantastic. I'm enjoying it so far.
Yeah. So this argument, this is chapter 3. We've got to chapter 3 in an hour and a half. You know,
that's pretty good.
I told you I love talking. So chapter 3 is that this must be a perfect world. So remember, you've got Omnigod. Omnigod is perfect, creates perfectly. God can't just do a really crap job of creating that's going to cause loads of pain and suffering, because otherwise pain and suffering is gratuitous. It didn't need to be that way, but it is just by random, or just by God just being less than. Well, that's a real problem. God cannot be all loving. God looks like morally abhorrent or less than he could be. It's a huge problem. What that then means is that, well, the only other way you can understand this, and Leibniz understood this, well, hundreds of years ago, that, and I'm going to read you a quote in a second, is that this universe either must be perfect now, or it must be the perfect way to achieve a perfect end. So if you look around you and say, well, it's not perfect now, I can pretty much guarantee this ain't perfect now. But if it's not perfect now and it's a perfect creation, it has to be the perfect way to get to this perfect point. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
Cool. So here's a quote from Leszek Kolakowski. I think is a Polish philosopher who wrote a book called Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing? And he wrote something that this sums up my argument perfectly. So, and sorry for the slightly long quote. Of course, there is evil, sin, and suffering in the world. Evil arises from the very imperfection of God's creatures, not God's faults, God's creatures. God could not have created them perfect, for then they would have been his equals. And it is logically impossible for there to be more than one God. Which is an interesting argument, that. God, Leibniz says, in accordance with traditional Christian theology, does not do evil. He merely allows it. But, and this is a crucial point, God allows only the minimum of evil that is possible in the world. God must be infinitely good because he is perfect, and goodness is entailed by perfection by definition. He is also infinitely wise, and from those two attributes, goodness and wisdom, it follows that he must have created the best of all possible worlds, that is, a world in which the sum of good is as great as it could possibly be, and the sum of evil is as small as it could possibly be. God looked over all possible worlds and must have solved an infinitely complex equation which produced our world as the solution. A world with no evil in it may have been possible, but it would not have been a world peopled by it, but it would have to be a world peopled by automata without free will. God calculated that infinitely more good than that other possible world without evil and without freedom. We live, therefore, in the best of all possible worlds, and this conclusion, which so infuriated Voltaire, follows ineluctably from the very concept of God as a perfect being. He is not only the creator of everything, but also the sovereign and loving father of his human subjects. We might wonder we might wonder whether this argument could convince someone who is dying of hunger or being tortured to death, but the question does nothing to shake Leibniz's faith. He does not deny that evil and suffering exist, only that their existence is a good argument against God's goodness. And hopefully that made sense. Like, he's calculating all of different worlds that could be, but has to produce the thing that is the most optimally loving. And so this world is that thing.
So we all know that theodicy was created to respond to the problem of evil. And St. Aquinas, I think he polished some of the St. Aquinas argument about, a bit of evil must be allowed because that's how a character is developed. This is how the right balance for all things to be achieved. And that's why the problem or the argument of evil has been sort of rehashed, and we have the evidential problem of evil. So we're not talking about paper cuts here. We're not talking about lining up early in the morning to get your new iPhone type of suffering.
But we are. No, but I would disagree with that. But so the great thing about the problem of evil argument, as properly understood, is that every single unit of pain, from the smallest, which is you stubbing your toe in the morning, to the biggest, like genocide or tsunamis or whatever, pandemic, right? It doesn't matter how big or small the suffering is. It needs to be explained. It cannot be gratuitous. So you're stubbing your toe has to be, or you're getting annoyed at the queue at the Apple store, has to be explained in light of Omnigod, just as much as a tsunami has to be explained. If even one stubbed toe is unnecessary but happens, God does not exist, or Omnigod does not exist. I think it's worth dwelling on that. Honestly, it's sometimes more powerful to think of the smallest piece of pain and suffering you can imagine, as opposed to the biggest. We all think about tsunamis and pandemics, but actually, the world cannot be in a place where you didn't stub your toe this morning, because if it could have been a place where you didn't stub your toe, you wouldn't have stubbed your toe. So your stubbing your toe is absolutely necessary for the greatest good to come about.
So I am going to argue this with you now. I'm glad we're getting to a point where we might slightly disagree, and this will probably invoke a greater conversation. And I'm going to bring up another interesting movie called Equilibrium by Christian Bale, where humanity has realized that the reason why we are the whole horrible shebang of killing and thieving is emotions. And what they started to do is we started to ban everything to do with arts, music, anything that will invoke emotions, because emotions lead to imperfections and therefore horrible things. So Christian Bale was one of the officers. He's actually one of the worst officers there. He used to uphold the law. He gets a cold. These people are having some opera music, symphonies, and some arts, stashed in their house. He goes, raids the house. And hears a bit of whimpering, opens a bonnet, and there was a sort of a trunk, and there was a puppy in there. And according to this movie and the rules, you got to shoot the puppy. You're not allowed to have anything that will invoke emotions. And this guy was the most gruesome. He points the gun and he freezes for a second. He just couldn't. And he decided to save the puppy. Takes it back home. And all the shades were closed because you're not allowed to see sunrise or sunset, and therefore invoke any type of emotions. And for the first time, he opens the blind to see the sunset and starts crying like a baby. And the argument here is, it looks like through a little bit of pain, and we know that there are certain things us as humans can sort of collaborate around, can do things that we wouldn't do if we're just cold and detached and everything is perfect. But we know that, and it does not need to invoke a super entity. This particular condition invokes certain qualities that are so human, and we kind of like in a way.
This is the kind of, you can't have cold without warm, or warm without cold, and the idea that in order to have the goodness, you have to have a little bit of bad, and sometimes the bad allows you to feel the good even more. But I mean, this kind of, I don't disagree with you. Actually, equilibrium is exactly what I'm saying here. So this argument is that this is the optimally perfect world, and we are in some kind of equilibrium. So I go back. Yes, I agree with you, Hanney, but actually, I think you've argued my point, which is to say that if we're in this perfect equilibrium, you cannot have not stubbed your toe. Your stubbed toe, it feeds into this equilibrium of optimal perfection. Now, you have to bite the bullet. The Christian has to bite the bullet here and say, because there can be no gratuitous evil, which means to say that there is no other way that God could have got to wherever we're going to, and whatever the end game is. There is no other way that God could have done it without including either your stubbed toe, carnivorousness, genocide, tsunamis, Ebola, cancer, just death in general, getting old and dying, dementia, phobias, psychological conditions, pain and loss and suffering. All of those things are the optimally perfect way of getting to wherever we're going. And there is no other way that God could have done it, because if there was another way that was slightly more optimal, slightly more loving, and this is what Leibniz says, if there was another way, this would be it.
Yes, yeah, I get your point, because it's like the argument of you got to take the injection to, but then why create the disease that requires the injection in the first place?
But then you take this step back and say, well, why? There are arguments that we're going to come to talk about. Well, the carnivorous one is great, which is okay. Why don't we all photosynthesize? Why didn't God create the universe and design us all in such a way that we photosynthesize and we get all our energy? Why do we even need energy? And so there are all these rabbit hole arguments you can go down, but you're absolutely right. You start looking further back and you start none of it makes sense. What would you predict given omni-God? What would you predict given naturalistic atheism? What does this? So when you start talking black holes, pandemics, stubbing toes, do these better support God is love or God doesn't exist? And I think the answer is actually really obvious. And
yes.
And in order to say that it better supports God exists, you have to put loads of add-ons. You have to start putting all this extra programming in and all these extra like arguments and stuff that add it on and ad hoc and post hoc and all this stuff, that you've got this really complicated theology, which is basically what the Bible and theologians do, in order to say, oh yeah, no, it is better predicted or better supported by this theory. It's like, what?
So using abductive logic here, this is data.
Yeah.
We stub our toes. We have paper cuts. We die of cancer. And all of these things can easily be explained away through we're clumsy beings. We stub our toes in the middle of the night. Where our cells decay and get old, and they not able to regenerate, so we get cancer. So all of these can be completely understood
better understood. And actually, when you properly understand evolution, you understand that evolution is a suboptimal designer. Like, that's the nature of evolution. So it uses the least stuff it can. So if you were to sit down and design the perfect human, you would absolutely smash evolution out of the ground. Right, it would be easy for us to design a perfect human. If you had like, here what a human needs to do, here's how I designed a body. It would not have like I wouldn't have lost my hair for a start. I mean, goodness me, what is going on there? So like evolution gets away with getting us from A to B in the most efficient way possible, arguably. But it has to use what's already been there, and then if the things are not necessary but not deleterious, then they just kind of get left up. They can like remain with us, but they're not like, it's not.
Yeah, because the cost of change and evolution is quite high. So there are trade-offs, and sometimes you have to do with something that's less optimum because it's a lot cheaper to work with what you've got than make a complete change.
I just had to laugh at Ray Oshima. The Ray Oshima's quote in the live chat. It just made me laugh. Sorry.
Okay.
That's a Freudian slip of a typo there. Absolutely hilarious.
Constellation Pegasus, this is probably something that I could address. That he's talking about the Quran. There's a verse in the Quran where demons cause the shooting stars were created to shoot demons. And if somebody in the moderators, please, if you can pull out the Quran verse that says that. I don't remember what's the number of the verse, but there is indeed one in Quran that says that asteroids and stars are actually were created to shoot down demons and jinns who want to listen on God's plans forever while he's sort of scheming.
I mean, this is where, you look at the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and its biblical cosmology is so horrendously wrong that just on that alone, you're like, why would God use that as a primary revelation to us if he knew it was wrong? And you can argue this for slavery. I mean, a particularly strong argument for slavery, really powerful. I mean, right. I could talk about biblical cosmology. It gets affirmance, or that is all wrong. So actually, the Bible is wrong. Why do I need to believe it for anything else? It's just wrong on its claims, right? As the Quran was in a way that you were saying. But when you talk about slavery, right? Slavery is abhorrent, right? Using other human beings as slaves is morally abhorrent. I think if the Bible fails on slavery, it just fails. You don't need to look any further. It fails on slavery. Therefore, you can jettison the Bible and not bother with anything else because it was so wrong on slavery. And what makes it even more wrong is that as a revelation, it countenances slavery in many different forms, and it justifies slavery in many different forms. But the worst part is that then God knew that this would be the revelation, and God's got divine foreknowledge, and he knew that the Bible would be used for 1,900 of the last 2,000 years to justify slavery. The slave traders were Christian in the antebellum South. That slave trade was a Christian thing. We had 1,900 years of Christians justifying slavery using the Bible. Now, even if they were wrong, if God uses the Bible as a primary revelation and knew it would be like misinterpreted, then that is irresponsible. All it would take is that for Moses and the 10 commandments, the 11 commandments,
yes,
where number one should be slavery is bad. God is really big on this, so we're writing it in capitals. Slavery is bad. Don't do it. right? And then that then puts to bed all the
But
other
Jonathan, it's actually way worse than that. Slavery was bad to God, but only when it came to his own people. The whole Exodus scenario is God wasn't very happy with his own people being enslaved, but he's all right with the rest of them.
They went straight out of Egypt into Canaan and said, right, we can enslave the Canaanites. So some abolitionist theologians use Exodus as a liberatory theology, and they say, look, this supports abolition because it's all about bringing them out of Egypt and out of bondage. It's like, hang on, you just stopped the story a bit early there. Like, that's convenient, because they go into this other country and enslave a bunch of other people and kill them and destroy their cities. So, you know, it is, the Bible fails on slavery alone.
Which shoots morality down as well. That's the arbitrary. That's the dilemma where is it good because God. That's a divine command theory here, which is basically it's moral because God's whim deemed it to be moral at that point in that context, but not anywhere else. And that shoots down morality as well. We got to the 90 minutes point, and I think we've covered so much ground. I'm actually quite proud of what we've achieved today.
There are as I say, I like talking. I can talk quickly, but I think there's so much juicy stuff, and it just it's so easy to go down rabbit holes, and then we've just basically touched on the first four arguments, I think maybe. So 26 more to go.
Well, we give a lot of background as well that we don't have to go through again. The ontology of the episode. We've given a lot of background. I guess then the rest of the series, if you would agree to come back and we'd be very happy to have you on board again and go through them. I think maybe 5 an episode or something like that, and we can. But I'm so happy that I've had this conversation with you today. You're exactly the way I've imagined. I love the way you think, Jonathan. We've got very, very similar way of thinking in so many areas.
I appreciate you inviting me, and I really appreciate this conversation. It's been a delight, Hanney. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I guess this is probably the one last super chat we're going to take.
Get them in quickly. Super chats, get them in.
For your tuning in. Bible commentary says itself, the verses 9 to 20, the last chapter of Mark, says they are forgeries that were added to the later because okay.
So this is absolutely true. So from verse 9 onwards is an interpolation. In many Bibles, it's in brackets actually because it's known as an interpolation. They were added later because the text does not match the time of being written. You actually get this a few times. I think there was the third letter. What's the third letter to the? Oh, I can't remember. One of Paul's letters, which is a forgery, is written basically to counter Paul's own theology to later people saying, well, he can't have believed this, so we're just going to invent this letter to say that he doesn't believe that. And he's like, this is why Hector Avalos, the late Hector Avalos, wrote The End of Biblical Studies that looks at all the stuff like this, which is it's such a problem trying to, hold the Bible up as some great revelation when, you've got problem with interpretation, you've got problem with translation, you've got problem with, forgeries, you've got problem with interpolations, so on and so forth. And that's just another example. It doesn't have Mark doesn't have the appearance events, and that's the earliest one. So actually, I think, this is completely nothing to do with what we were talking about. I could talk about this for a long time, but this is evidence that those things were later additions, that those stories didn't exist at that time because they would have been included. And in fact, I would include the empty tomb as a story. Didn't exist until Mark invented the beginning of the empty tomb. It was then given some extra, furnished with extra details and embellished later on, and it didn't exist in Paul. Paul never mentions it. Mark mentions it for the first time. Matthew invents some guards to answer the Jewish criticisms that there was that the body was stolen. So Mark was the first person to mention this. So then there was the Jewish reaction. Matthew then reacts to the Jewish reaction and puts in a counter-apologetic or a counter-polemic to say that there were guards at the tomb. Luke and John don't include the guards at the tomb because it's obviously a load of bollocks. But all of this goes together, and I could bore you for a long time, but all of this shows that Paul didn't have the empty tomb narrative at the time that Paul was writing as the earliest, and it shows that it was invented there and embellished later on.
Yeah, considering the Paul's writing or predates the Gospels, I think it was the year 20. So they're supposed to be, so early on, straight after the alleged resurrection, the empty tomb narrative wasn't as developed as we've seen later in Gospels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you to Roger and Ricky for those generous comments. So I'm glad you've enjoyed it, and it wasn't all in vain.
Thank you so much. Well, folks, that's the end of the show today. We kept it short today, but next one we're going to be tackling methodically the arguments, and I look forward to chatting with you again, Jonathan, in the next few weeks.
Likewise.
All right, folks, thank you so much, and I'll see you in a broadcast in the next couple of days.
Take care, y'all.